Hello, and welcome to the Emotional Endurance Movement. I'm Lori Sharp Page with Crimson McDonald. We're here to talk about all the lemons in the room and how we're coping with them. And we're here today to talk about the dynamics of a toxic work environment. So I'm guessing you've been there, done that, got that t-shirt, maybe even a few times like me and Crimson. Hi, Crimson.
Hi, Lori. Good morning.
Good morning. I've got my coffee and I'm ready to talk about the hottest tea in our life in the last 15 years. Big 360 moment to us meeting until this moment right here. It has been a journey, and I am excited to unpack this.
Yeah, so let's see. It has been 16 or 17 years. It was 2008, May or June. Lori and I
Yes.
met in a corporate boardroom at, I was straight from graduate school, really ambitious. Lori was straight from Miami, University of Miami.
No.
Oh,
Mm-mm.
you were from New
No.
York and then.
I was coming off my first stint in market research to a new consulting role, a new gig after being with for a couple of years. I went to Miami University. Miami University is in Ohio. I know it's freaking confusing, but it's hilarious that you introed it like that because anyone who goes to Miami, Ohio would have a strong reaction.
Anyone that lives in Cincinnati knows a million people that went to Miami that has a strong reaction, which
Yeah.
makes it even funnier.
It is funny. So day one, we locked eyes across the boardroom, and I like to remember it as like we both telepathically exchanged what the F is going on here because the vibes are weird, right?
It was straight out the gate weird. They treat us like an incoming class, which is nice. You all get trained the same. But it was definitely my first corporate existential crisis.
My first corporate existential crisis.
I think it was a pretty traumatic work environment for both of us. Our relationship was a product of trauma bonding at Ipsos. It's been a huge part of both of our stories. It derailed my whole career in research. It completely turned me off. It derailed your career in terms
Yeah.
of the trigger for major changes. And it's just fascinating because now here we are, like, 16, 17 years later, and we are building a business together about emotional endurance in the workplace. And I think it comes from a place of wanting to help build healthy work environments so people don't have to experience what we experience where we met.
No, totally. If we could go back in time and help 24, 25-year-old Lori and Crimson with managing this toxic environment, what would that look like?
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting that we both left, and sometimes that is the solution to leave and do something else. I went to grad school to become a clinician. It was just not a good fit for me industry wise. The work itself did not engage me in a way that was was rewarding. It was also highly stressful. I was in a highly stressed, low reward state and I just burned out. But for a lot of people, they may be burning out, but they're in the right place. They maybe are stuck with people around them that don't support them or don't treat them well because that person's dealing with their own insecurities, difficulty managing their emotional regulation. And I think it becomes very much a game of like, in life, we are going to find these challenging situations and environments. And sometimes the answer is to leave, and sometimes the answer is to stay. But either way, how do you cope with that? How do you make meaning from that and let yourself move forwards and not get consumed by the environment? Because that to me was the part that got really bad at the end is there was nothing else really going on in my world except for the drama at work. That for me was the part that I think I'd love to be able to save people from, to interrupt the pattern before they get there because it sucks. It sucks for you, it sucks for your family, it sucks for everybody around you. And it takes time to build back up from that.
Yeah, I mean, and that brings me to, so, I do social media. I'm not someone that's like social media is triggering. I fully engage in it, but I've never really been in the LinkedIn world just because I've had such a weird career. I haven't had to. And with our new endeavor, I've been spending more time there. And I think it's fascinating because
Yeah.
I didn't realize it until I opened LinkedIn that most of my trauma in adulthood has come from the workplace. And so, like, I get on LinkedIn, I'm connected with these people that I worked with, and it's not I'm not really connected with many of the people that were actually, like, the doers, but, it was still, like, going through it, it's, like, all of these, like, triggering memories of these horrible moments in my life, and but the thing that sticks out with to me the most is how many people are now, like, executive, C-level executives at Ipsos, at these companies. Ipsos isn't alone in places that I saw dysfunction, and people stayed, and, it makes me wonder, Lori, like, were we the snowflakes? Were we the millennial
Yes.
snowflakes?
I think we had different stakes in the game than a lot of our colleagues. A lot of our colleagues were years into their market research careers, and they had found a good place to build their career, right?
Yeah.
I think the stakes were different for you and me being new to our careers. The stakes were lower. My team had a lot of messy coping, myself included. I had a lot of people that were dealing with tough situations at home and at work, a lot of pressure to deliver certain outcomes. It created an environment I no longer wanted to come to work every day. And I was at a stage in my life where I could take that gamble and go and do something else. And becoming a clinician was the right thing for me to do. Do I think that there's things that I did that made that experience harder on myself? Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the biggest ones being that there was a lot of triangulation is the clinical term, but it's basically talking about each other. If you've got a group of three, you got two that talk to each other about the other one and vice versa. We saw that in the most
White
recent season of
Lotus.
White Lotus.
Yeah, that's what I was
Yeah,
thinking
right?
about, how they
That
brought that
dynamic,
dynamic.
that relationship is such a perfect example of triangulation. And often in toxic workplaces where there's not a lot of emotional safety, we see these toxic communication dynamics. It's not like wrong or bad to talk about somebody if they're not there. But if this is the way that we're coping with our stress or overwhelm at that person or anxiety about what they're doing, it gets really messy really fast. And I definitely got involved in that triangulation because it felt like power to me in a place where I felt really powerless
Mhm.
and helpless. So I think that yes, I was ill-equipped to properly cope. And then I had other stuff going on at home and I was not coping well with that either. And then I don't know what was going on with my colleagues, but one was extremely anxious to the point that she would micromanage every dynamic, which was very uncomfortable.
Mm.
And the other one would become emotionally dysregulated. But you didn't know. And hers wasn't so much like lashing out, although that did happen a time or two. It was more like shutting down and like starting to like hide things or like disengage and like hold back on feedback, like just kind of starting to kind of ace me out, you know?
And that's I think it's important to name that's a level of toxic behavior that's not always called out as toxic behavior because it's not so overt, like I think it's important to remember, you know, being dysregulated at work doesn't necessarily mean screaming at people. That passive aggressive, the withholding information, the inconsistency, all of those are signs that you're working with dysregulated people.
Absolutely. And another one to keep in mind, and it's so interesting because the neuroscience really shows us that dysregulation can show up in different ways. And when people are dysregulated, they don't feel emotionally safe. So they're
Mhm.
less likely to be able to make critical decisions without some level of bias or agenda. So they can't really look at the full picture. They're more reactive. They're more likely to be like ruminating or obsessing. I wish I could go back in time and teach myself more skills to manage that discomfort because I do think without skills to manage the discomfort, it ended up me jumping right back into the triangulation, which was me being dysregulated in that space. So I wouldn't say that I was a snowflake, but I would say that I was somebody that was struggling to cope and was bringing that mess to work. And unfortunately, I think I was in a dynamic with a couple other people that were doing the same. You were going through, I know you were on a different, we were on the same floor, but you were on a different team. And I know you went through something totally different than kind
Well,
of what
and
I did.
doesn't that show the array of dysfunction at one company,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, there was a door between our sections, but you're right. It's funny because I'm glad we didn't talk about this before we recorded. The snowflake question, I did make decisions that enabled more toxicity. So I take accountability. When you put all that aside, I did not have the words. Honestly, a lot of your thought leadership, Lori, has brought the words to it. I was unprepared for the dysregulation. I've always had corporate white collar jobs from 16 to 18. I did physical therapy, worked at a consulting firm as an admin. I spent 8 years in undergrad and graduate school at a law firm that was family ran. So it totally had a different vibe, right? We had very different toxic patterns. And so my thought was the one, like when I went to corporate, that I kind of expected like less toxicity because I expected more structure, and I thought that that institutional structure would account for the actual behavioral part of humans. And I was completely caught off guard at a huge global corporation. I was flabbergasted. The acceptance of the behavior, the political person in me, the injustice. Look how they're treating this person versus this person, and then equity. I think you're right. What both of us went through was very different. I could not believe so many people were on board with it, which brings me back to like when I see they're all still there, it's like, what's like, what did what was right about it?
Crimson, she did the big reveal when we started digging into LinkedIn because of this new business. We found out something astonishing, which is that everybody else stayed.
They all survived.
They all stayed. They all survived. They're flourishing over
Oh,
there.
absolutely. Everyone we worked with at it was very smart. I thought I was among smart people, good work ethic. I had nothing bad to say at the individual level. Maybe a couple of individuals, but like these people we're talking about as LinkedIn are people I have the utmost respect for, which is why I'm like, what's wrong with me?
People stay at toxic environments for different reasons. And the first thing we got to call out is the fact that what was toxic to me, what was toxic to you, may not be considered toxic by someone else.
Right.
The other thing to keep in mind is that, there's a cost benefit analysis here.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, the cost of staying in a environment that is toxic is lower than the cost of finding something new.
And this will be my behavioralist nerd moment, but there's a book, Sway, the Irresistible Pull of Irrational Behavior, which I reference this book more than any book I think I've ever read ever. But it does talk about how, and I think it's been reinforced, especially by the generation that raised us, by the boomer generation, you don't quit, right? Like you get through it. Like quitting is a badge of failure. And I do think, like, when I look back at the Ipsos situation, I think a lot of people were unhappy, but I think they were in like this commitment by it. Like they had made a commitment to something. And the reality was because of the economy, because they had kids, whatever it was, to your point, you're doing a cost benefit analysis. And like, I think for the human brain, once you're committed to something, once you're in the routine, once you're habituated, once you've built your life around it, the idea of breaking it is just it's just too much. And so it's almost like the discomfort of toxicity becomes more comfortable than the discomfort of finding a new job, or the discomfort of taking the pay hit and having to sacrifice, or the discomfort of even having the confrontation. Maybe you could fix it, right? Maybe
Yeah.
you could
Maybe you
fix
could
it.
address it.
Yeah, you could address it in a way that
Or
fixes
address
it.
the way you're showing up for it, right? Which we
Right.
would argue that's a big part of what we do with our company is we help individuals and organizations interrupt those patterns so that they show up differently. And if we think about a workplace system, it's like everybody's doing a dance, right?
Mhm.
The only thing we have to do to change the dance is our own steps.
Yeah,
That's really the empowerment.
I think people get stuck in dysfunctional work environments because it's so hard to break the cycles. It's like every cycle. Your work relationship is like your home relationships, and the same human behavior cycles are happening. To your point, it's also where we were in our lives. We were able to get up and leave. A lot of people had assigned a lot of value to their jobs at because they worked so hard for it. When you work a job where you have to work 80, 90 hours a week just to survive, you put so much emphasis on what that value means to you. And I was like, if we can't work 70 hours a week to get our deliverables, we ain't doing something right. We're either inefficient, understaffed, or under delivering. There's no way to do it. Other people's attitudes were like, no, you just do it. You make the sacrifice.
The general toxicity of the market research industry.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, such as myself, had already come from or done a lap around at one or one of the other market research institutions. Now, it's interesting, in our market research is already a small world, and it kind of has a little bit of like a sexy appeal, I think. You know what I mean? People are
Mm.
like, ooh, market research. I'm here to
Okay.
tell you.
Fun.
Yeah.
Qualitative was fun. Watching people grocery shop, that was fun.
Not nearly as sexy as people think. But anyway, we were small fish in a medium pond trying to court the biggest catfish in town.
Sure.
It was a hyper competitive market. Because of that, the expectation was do whatever it takes for the client. Interestingly, at my previous gig, they trained us explicitly to never say no to the client,
Okay.
to always say yes. What was interesting at Ipsos is they trained us to say no, but. And I think that small difference in mindset probably clicked for a lot of people that this was a better option than some of the other options out there.
Makes sense.
At the end of the day, research is a commodifiable thing, and you can go to any of these research companies and get a product from whomever. But if they're all working 80, 90 hours a week, if that is the industry expectation and standard, which is itself toxic, we need to talk about that. That's problematic.
Mhm.
But if that's what's required, then I do think people get a little bit more nuanced on the fact that, like, yeah, but they allow me to say no, but.
Yeah. No, it's true. But didn't we have rules? Or am I making this up? Like you had 2 hours to respond to client email.
Yeah.
And I guess I was really disappointed, Lori, that like I couldn't just tough it out and keep taking the paycheck and just like stuck it up. And that there was that part of me that was like, no, this is wrong. People shouldn't cry in the bathroom. I shouldn't get screamed at. You shouldn't treat someone like that. You shouldn't let this person get picked on. Just could not. I could not acquiesce. It sucked. Dude, let's bring it back to Neanderthals. What did Neanderthals do that we do today? Work. Survival is work. So whether you're building a tent out of leaves to get through the night, or you're collecting firewood for the fire to cook your food, or you're hunting for your food, or you're making your clothes, humans were made to work. The correlation between work and mental health, the neuroscience behind it, work is a vital part of existence. And so I would always get mad when they're like, millennials don't like to work. It's like, no, I want to work, but I want to work without the bullshit.
This is where it's not about micromanaging the culture, but this is where it becomes leadership's job to really set tone, that regulation at the workplace and all of its different forms versus dysregulation at the workplace and all of its different forms. Regulation is the preferred state. We don't expect everybody to stay there forever, but that is the preferred state. Conscious coping builds emotional endurance. People know this. The more they show up for tough things, the better they get at it. What we struggle with is how to talk about that in an organizational manner without micromanaging people. And a lot of organizations will get bottlenecked because they will build whole teams and systems around the avoiding discomfort, which is them contributing to a toxic work environment. If someone had eyes on my team, I think they would have very easily seen the dynamic that was going on was not healthy or productive. More than having somebody's eyes on the team telling us that we weren't that way, if we had just known that we were working shit out on each other, that we were doing things that were making an already stressful situation worse. And we were tolerant enough to discomfort to receive that feedback and
Right.
internalize that feedback. That would have been the most powerful way to interrupt. And that's what we do. That's what our business does is we are the interrupters that teach the people the skills, empower them, and then we take a step back and let the system really flourish from there. So I think that would have been the best way to interrupt it. How transformative would it be if everybody had the emotional endurance to deal with difficult things effectively and in the moment to
Yeah.
get when people are dysregulated, it doesn't have good outcomes. It ripples
Mhm.
through your life and through the lives of your relationships, your family, your colleagues, even your community. So we need to be real about how we're showing up, but it's first and foremost for ourselves and our well-being, but also understanding how these things impact each other, impact others. And that's where kind of the emotional hygiene comes in. When I think
Mhm.
about us back when we had this job, I don't think maybe we had great emotional hygiene. I certainly didn't. I didn't have good boundaries. I was engaging in triangulation. And that's where I'd really like to close today is to talk about like if you can't leave a toxic working situation or you don't want to, for whatever reason, we're not judging your cost benefit analysis math. We just want you to do it, you know?
Right.
But if you're not leaving, what can you do to stay and cope with it? And
I
yeah,
utilized
please.
the 14th floor therapist. I got into therapy immediately. I spent my time in therapy learning how to get through the week, and she helped me figure out how to survive it. I definitely leverage that tool.
Make sure you're setting clear boundaries. Part of my challenge is I didn't have good work-life balance, so I didn't know how to I am more aware of like not bringing personal stuff to professional relationships because that's not always the right domain to be exploring that stuff. And you don't know necessarily how safe you are to express that sort of stuff or how triggered the other person might get if
Right.
you do. So that is one thing to keep in mind. I think that is also the hygiene piece is being mindful that like it's not our job to go trauma dump on other people even if we are having a bad day or in a difficult situation, we want to try and keep that trauma dumping at a minimal because it is viral. It does go viral. It spreads through organizations and it tends not to leave us feeling any better either. So that's a piece of this. And then the biggest thing, and I've said this multiple times, is control what you can control. Make an intentional choice, stick with it, control what you can control, and find ways to find balance. I know a lot of what I'm talking about is super nuanced, but that's where the freedom is. That's where the empowerment is when you say, you know what, this is what it is, and I'm going to find a way to build my life around it by really focusing on those micro steps of coping effectively with what is. Work environments present a unique example of that struggle, but that struggle is present. It's evergreen. It's ever present for all of us. The empowerment comes from accepting that and then committing to do the work to stay as best you can, show up emotionally regulated and stay emotionally regulated, especially at work, because dysregulation can have huge impacts on safety, productivity, innovation, and of course, what we're talking about today, culture.
Yeah, quality of life.
Well, this is great. I really enjoyed breaking this down and helping to answer, why people stay in toxic work environments, how people leave toxic work environments, and how people can stay and not lose themselves in toxic work environments. And obviously, there's a lot to unpack here, but the main thing we want you to know is that we see you out there trying to break these cycles and find a better way of being at work and at home. And we are here for it. We stand you and we want to support you in any way that we can. Thank you so much, Crimson, for joining me today in this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for listening.
Make sure to like and follow and become part of the emotional endurance movement at emotionalendurancemovement.com.